Before we begin episode 37 of the ClassCast podcast, I'd like to say just a few words about the CLT exam, its CEO Jeremy Wayne Tate, my guest for this episode, and how it sort of got onto my radar. Jeremy and I spoke for a few minutes before we started rolling the tape, and so I didn't realize until afterwards that this portion was not actually included in the recorded podcast. I first heard of the CLT exam early in the school shutdown, somewhere in, I think, April, when the SAT and ACT began announcing that they were shutting down and canceling their tests because of the pandemic. A good friend of mine growing up, Katie Brogue, is now a director of admissions at a classical Christian school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She messaged me and asked if I had ever heard of the CLT exam and whether or not any of my students were taking it since the other tests had been canceled. I had no idea what she was talking about, and I asked a few other friends who are teachers or who do test prep tutoring, and none of them had heard of it either. So I did a little research, I tracked down the website, and I ended up following Jeremy Wayne Tate on Twitter. Now, Jeremy's a very interesting guy, and as you're going to hear in this podcast, he is charismatic and knowledgeable and passionate about education. But the way this podcast recording actually got started was that I was following him on Twitter, and I started to comment and go a little back and forth with him about some of the things that he would tweet. His tweets are very successful. He's adding thousands of followers, seemingly each week, because it's sort of polarizing. It's very interesting. And so one of the things I'll say before, and I think I might say this again at the end of the podcast, is I strongly recommend anyone who's interested in education or in college admissions to follow him on Twitter, because you're going to see things that you will respond to. You will love it or you will hate it, but you will not feel apathetic about very many of the things that Jeremy says on his Twitter account. And for example, one of my favorite tweets that he put out was, he said, "My line of business gives me every reason to pander to the radical left and signal to PC culture, but I will not. I am all in for truth." Now, that sounds kind of radical, and it may be, but when you actually have a conversation with Jeremy and you hear his thoughts on why a classical education is important and why some respect to traditions and transmission of culture is so important, both for individual growth but also for a healthy society overall, with that context, the tweet sort of sounds very different. And so after responding to a few of his tweets, Jeremy messaged me and asked if I would be interested in talking with him. He thought that we might have very different views on education, but he would be interested in having the discussion and sort of sorting it out. And I thought that's admirable, because he's reaching out to me thinking there's going to be a disagreement. I told him that I probably agree with him at least 40-50% of the time with the things he says on Twitter, but I don't always respond to those. And, in the podcast, you're going to hear a great conversation where I probably agree with 75 or 80% of the things he says in this discussion, maybe a little more than that. And so I think that this is both a very interesting discussion, and the CLT exam is something I think more people should be aware of. But I also think that this is a great example of why strictly communicating with people through social media doesn't always do justice to complex issues. When Jeremy and I actually sit down and have a long-form conversation, we find a lot of mutual agreement, we find a lot of middle ground, and we find places where we can thoughtfully disagree. But if you're always operating on Facebook or on Twitter and you're always limited to 280 characters or sharing someone else's memes, then sometimes we can't dig deep into the things that we care most about, and as a result, we misrepresent our ideas or we misunderstand other people's. So I would like to put forth episode 37 of the ClassCast podcast both as a great conversation with a CEO of an up-and-coming education company, but also as an example of why people should have conversations, both with people they agree with and disagree with, why we should ask questions, why we should dig deep, think hard, and try to really understand what people's motivations and goals are. I think if we were to judge Jeremy specifically off of one or two tweets, I know I personally would have a very different impression than I do at the end of this discussion that you're about to listen to. So one, please listen to the entire discussion. Jeremy Wayne Tate is a very interesting guy, and he's doing some great work in the field of education. And two, I recommend you check him out on Twitter, because it's a nice reminder of how someone's representations on social media are representative of their beliefs, but sometimes don't include the full context or the broader understanding that's necessary to really understand them or to find what you might agree or disagree with. And so when you have the opportunity to sit down and talk with someone for a period of time, I think that we should always do that. We should make time for people. I would like to thank Katie Brogue for informing me of the CLT exam and sort of setting up this line of thinking. And again, I would like to thank Jeremy Wayne Tate for taking the time to have this conversation. I think it's really productive, hear a lot of great stuff, and there's a lot for all of us, anyone who's interested in education. There's a lot for us to think about here. Without further ado, please enjoy episode 37. Welcome to the 37th episode of the ClassCast podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, we'll be speaking with Jeremy Wayne Tate, the CEO of the CLT exam, Classic Learning Test. This is a sort of new and up-and-coming standardized test that's helping a lot of students with their college admissions process. They're adding testers and students every year, also adding new schools that accept and acknowledge the exam each year. And since this is the point of the podcast is to talk to people about things we can do to improve education and think a little bit outside the box, this seemed like an ideal conversation for us because this is taking a new approach, or at least a different approach, to the ideas of standardized testing and how we're providing students with access both to their college admissions and maybe to the ideas that we want them focusing on throughout their education anyway. So, yeah, Jeremy, thank you very much for taking the time to talk. We already started to do a little basic greeting here, but I'm sure I didn't do a great job with introducing the test. So before we say anything else, obviously, thank you for being here, but do you want to say a few words and clarify what is the CLT? Because, of course, you can say it better than I can.
Yeah, Ryan, thanks so much for having me, and I appreciate what you're doing and raising awareness for a lot of good things happening in education right now. It's a time of massive disruption within the education sphere, and I think CLT is a part of that. So we're just about 5 years old. My own background was running an SAT, ACT prep company in Catonsville, Maryland, and also serving as a college counselor as well. Before that, I was an avid teacher, spent 10 years in the public school system, spent 3 in inner city New York, teaching at Progress High School in Brooklyn, New York, and then a couple years at Old Mill High School, and then my final 3 at Broadneck before transitioning into the private school arena. Louisiana State graduate, go LSU Tigers, and then I went to seminary for graduate school at Reformed Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C.
Okay, great. That's awesome. And so you've got a lot of diverse sort of perspectives to pull from. Just in case, I don't know if we get back to it, but I have an uncle who is a priest, and he went to seminary. I think he was about 15 or 16, and yeah. And we talk, both religion and just jobs and stuff. And I always tease him that his job is the same as mine, but it's a lot easier because he only has to know one book, and I got to know a few dozen. He doesn't like the joke. He doesn't like the joke. But so that's great. So for the CLT itself, how is this test set up? How is it similar to or different from, say, the SAT or ACT, maybe the test that maybe people listening are a little more familiar with?
Well, in hopes that your listeners will stay dialed in, on the surface level, you would think what could possibly sound more boring than talking about standardized tests? Like, what could be more boring than taking a standardized test is talking about them, right? But at the same time,
practicing for them.
That's right, yeah. The reality is that standardized tests, especially a high-stakes test like the SAT and ACT, they really drive national curriculum. And sometimes when we make that case to people, it sounds very bizarre. Like, what do you mean they drive national curriculum? But if you think about it, just as a hypothetical, if the SAT and ACT required students to demonstrate something like French proficiency, students would start learning French, right? French immersion would go mainstream overnight. And so these tests play a really powerful role in what students actually learn. And so CLT was really born out of that idea that high-stakes tests tend to drive national curriculum. CLT is big on the humanities. We're big on the traditional liberal arts. Education, the kind of education, the intellectual tradition that gave birth to America was heavy on philosophy, political philosophy. In particular, it was born out of religious ideas about human nature as well. Mainstream education has really departed from that, and I think that's one of the reasons for social unrest and a general kind of disconnect to America's founding documents and even the whole idea of the American experiment. And so it's very pie in the sky to say, well, a test somehow can possibly have that level of change. But the goal with CLT is to put students in front of what we say is the best of what has been thought and said. So people call that the classics. Put students in front of the best of what has been thought and said in the hopes that drives it back into the classroom as well, and we can kind of have a rebirth of learning with that.
So that's a really interesting idea that, the goal maybe has more to do with curriculum than the assessment itself. And in a way, in the classroom, we think of it almost as reverse design. What do you want the kids to know? Figure out what that end product or result's supposed to be, and then design backwards to the start point of your unit or your lesson or whatever that may be. And so, and to a certain extent, that's probably true that the tests do drive that sort of stuff. This might be an unfair question given that you are the CEO of a testing company, right? So in an ideal world,
Yeah.
is that how that would work? Like,
No.
should the tests drive it like that?
And and in fact, I would say no, and that might sound wildly hypocritical. Like, wait a minute, what are you doing then? Well, look, in some ways, especially a standardized multiple choice test is a product of the Industrial Revolution and factory model education, and a lot of things. Somebody who loves classical education and this older vision of education that's highly relational, one-on-one. No, these things are not good. But College Board, who owns the SAT, they have kind of drawn up the rules of the game. We're playing in some ways kind of on their turf. CLT has to have a concordance chart that allows a college to say, okay, this score on the CLT equates to this on the SAT or this on the ACT. And so, in some ways, it's strange that we're using something that is a product of where we think education really went wrong, which is really late Industrial Revolution with the new kind of factory model education.
So, yeah, I mean, and it's one of those situations where when you join a game that's sort of already begun, it's hard to change the rules. So you gotta find a way to win the game that's already being played. In terms of that, like you pointed out the idea that a multiple choice test. And by the way, I'll do a quick full disclosure personally. I used to hate standardized testing, like through and through. I just thought it was unnecessary. I didn't really like it as a student. I did well on them, just I'm okay at tests, but I didn't like them. And as a teacher for a long time, I didn't. I've now warmed up a little bit. Yeah, well, I think that most of these tests are flawed because you can't really make one test that really encapsulates all the things you would want to know about a student and their abilities and progress, because we see so much grade inflation. And because the grading standards or expectations can be so different from division to division or even school to school, sometimes within a division, I've actually warmed up to the idea of the standardized test just because I don't know that, when the most common grade given in a school is a B+ or an A-, you're not actually holding people to a high standard. And it's not about excluding. It's not saying, well, you didn't do as well, you don't get into the school. My goal isn't to keep anyone out. It's just the point of a test is assessment. And if the grades aren't giving a fair reflection, then you need something. And so as much as I don't like the tests, I, in the last few years, have really warmed to the idea because it does give at least a standard measure, whereas the classroom teachers' grades too often don't, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I think most teachers are trying to do what's best for the students, but I also think that sometimes when the grades come too easy, they don't mean anything anymore. And so a test starts to set that bar. Now, for the idea of the standardized multiple choice test, you're talking about a curriculum and a kind of schooling that focuses, as you said, on philosophy, on classic literature, on the humanities, which tend to be the things that do not translate well to a multiple choice test. Like you can do math in a multiple choice test and you don't necessarily lose anything, but you can potentially lose some of the higher level thinking or at least water down some pieces of it. So how do you sort of remedy that situation where like you're talking about the humanities, which should be about language and critical thinking and all these higher level skills, but in the end, it's still a multiple choice test. So how does that work? Like, have you ever considered an essay test? I mean, I know that's like a nightmare to try to figure out scoring and the rest, but how do you remedy the classic ideals that you're trying to uphold with sort of the modern methodology that you're using?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Ryan. And you're at a public school in Loudoun County, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Well, yeah, and I love the question about grade inflation first before that question, because and it's even worse in the homeschool world and in the private school world. I'm a homeschool dad who sends my oldest to a private school, but look, private schools will even compete with each other by making it really easy to get a 4.0. The joke in every college admissions office in the country is that it's hard to meet a homeschool student without a 4.0 because mom and dad are doing their grading, right? So as bad as grade inflation is in the public school arena, it's probably worse in a lot of private schools and especially homeschools as well. So, but back to the test. So 2/3 of any passage we ever put on the CLT is from the CLT author bank. And CLT really defers to a board of academic advisors with about 55 people on there, mostly PhDs. We've got the founder of National Black Home Educators on there. We've got a really diverse group of educators who love and believe in the same body, the same corpus of great ideas and great authors. So this goes from Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas, Ben Franklin, Flannery O'Connor, C.S. Lewis. You go through that list, and it's a really rock star crew of authors who are really engaged in kind of the great why questions of life. Having spent 10 years in the classroom, I think that's what students are most interested in as well. And so, the mechanics of taking the CLT, it looks kind of like an SAT or ACT in a lot of ways, right? There's going to be a passage, and then there's going to be 10 questions based on that passage, and then you're going to move on to the next passage. But in terms of the source material, it's totally different. And so, whereas with an SAT or ACT, in fact, both of these companies have what they call a sensitivity committee. So they want to make sure that they don't put any student in front of a text that could possibly offend them for any reason. CLT takes literally the opposite approach, where we think, you know what?
You try to offend them as much as you can.
Well, we think if an author can't offend anyone, what they're saying probably isn't very important either. And so we put Nietzsche on our test. We put Darwin on our test. We put C.S. Lewis on our test. People who had a ton of pushback during their own day. Maybe that's kind of forgotten to history at times. And so we get feedback from students of like, I'm surprised that you put that on the CLT. We get that a lot. We take a lot of pride in not being afraid of any idea. And, my preoccupation as a teacher, I was always very nervous teaching that my students were bored. I was like neurotically scared that my students were bored. It was like my greatest fear ever. And so I love that with the CLT, like we're gonna shock you with what we're gonna put on this test. And you read some of the, I think students have this impression of like old books boring. You actually get into some of this stuff. I'm reading actually for the first time all the way through. I'm reading the Odyssey finally. It's wild, some of this stuff, if you read Grimm's fairy tales to your children, Ryan, as you're getting older, this stuff wouldn't even be allowed to get published today.
It's borderline child abuse to read that to a kid and then tell him to go to sleep.
I know, it's wild, but in some ways they love it. They love it. They're made for this stuff.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. In my English classes, so I teach. We might have some changes coming up this year, but for the last several years, I just finished my 14th year teaching, and I've probably taught 11th grade, which in Virginia is the year they take their standardized English tests. The only year they do standardized state testing for English in high school is 11th grade, and it's a reading and a writing test. And so I usually have all 11th grade. And so I always make the joke, everybody better treat me nice here because I'll sink this whole ship. I will send every faculty member to 10 extra meetings next year, tell every kid to bomb this thing. But I have usually like on level, we call it academic, like the regular 11th grade standard level, some team taught special ed classes, and then AP Lang, so that the College Board course. And so I sort of do the high and the low a little bit. And what I've found in the last maybe 5 years is that I actually get some of the best buy-in when we start. We don't always have to stick with it, but at least start with philosophy. Like we do a lot of philosophy, because at that point a kid can say, we use a little philosophical text or a thought experiment to start, and then we're going to go read this short story, or we're going to do this other work. When you do it that way, the kids feel like their ideas matter, and so even if they don't like the book that we're actually reading, they recognize that there's something thoughtful in it. And when you write a paper at the end, I've gotten a lot better at asking sort of broader questions about ethics and about what it is to be a human being, like to use real philosophical questions, because I can read a badly written but thoughtful essay, but I just hit a point where it's like, I cannot read another boring essay that has no ideas and bad grammar. And so by pushing, some of the philosophy and some classical ideas in there, I really do think gets at least better thinking done. It doesn't always translate to better reading or writing, but I agree the buy-in is better. Now, when I do that, though, I sort of scaffold it, and we use little sections, or it depends on the level. There has to be a little bit of prep work. And so I'm thinking about if I were to take some of those same segments and turn them into like test questions. One of the things, and I mean, it's similar. I know that the selection process is different, but the SAT now has the section that they call, I think it's like the Great Global Conversation, something like that. Yeah. And it's all documents or speeches that were inspired by America's founding ideals, though a lot of them are actually written by people from all over the world. But they're all in one way or another tie into those original sort of American ideals. One of the things that they stress is that you don't have to know anything about the person. Like, it's obviously easier, Yeah. So on the CLT, when you're, say, using something by Darwin, if we're talking about a homeschool student who has never come in contact with Darwin, they know little or nothing about him. I mean, they've heard the name, but they've never done any of the reading. Is that student at any disadvantage because they haven't been in contact with the author before? Like, how much of it is sort of content versus skills, I guess, is the question.
Yeah,
like,
that's a great...
Can they do a cold read and still be successful?
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at in some ways is kind of this great debate between aptitude testing and achievement testing. And so, the SAT, of course, rolled out in the 1920s as an aptitude test and really was committed to that until the 1990s when the big revisions happened. And now they've gone full board 100% achievement testing, meaning the test is totally based on what you learn and not based on, cognitive ability. ACT, of course, was always that way. CLT, we try to kind of split the difference, and we talk about fluency a lot. And so if you're a student and you love to read, I don't know how many students actually go to ESPN and read the articles, but if you love to read about sports, you develop a fluency. You can go from one sport to another. You understand the things that are happening. I think it's the same way where if you read heavily from, you don't have to read all the authors, but if you get somewhat familiar with kind of this classical tradition, you're going to have a degree of fluency that's not there, I think, for other students who maybe they don't drink from it or read from it as much.
And I don't know that there's a right answer to it. And that's the hard part about a standardized test is you're trying to create a standard. And then you think about how many people are going to take the test and all the different kinds of preparation and the rest. For the SAT, I do some SAT prep tutoring. And then I also, like I said, I teach the AP English Language and Composition class. Since the last SAT revision, it's amazing how similar they made the reading section of the SAT when they revised. I think it was 2015, 2016, somewhere around there.
Yep.
That updated in the reading section made it very, very similar to the AP Lang exam. It's actually a little bit easier. And then, so I was like, wow, that's kind of weird that they're setting themselves up to be able to say, look, if you take AP Lang, look how much better you do on your SAT, right? Yeah. Because, hey, you just took the class that built those skills. Now, it's none of its content. It's not vocabulary. It's not knowing the author, but you learn a set of critical reading and analysis skills that they then use. Yeah. And then what's really weird is just this year, we didn't actually take the full test because everything was online. They changed the AP exam, and there's now a writing multiple choice portion that is actually very similar to some of the writing SAT questions. And I was like, wow, they've kind of turned AP Lang into a little SAT prep thing. Wow. And I mean, from a business standpoint, it's very smart because you can say kids who are successful in our AP class do this much better on the SAT. But I don't know if that's a fair and honest way to do it. If your goal with the test is to steer curriculum a little bit, I'm not saying you're trying to do the same sort of academic inbreeding, so to speak, where you're creating your own market and stuff, but is that essentially the idea that you're saying, like, if we can get the test the way we like it and we get enough kids taking it, we can steer the skills and the texts being used in the direction we want? You see what I'm saying? Like, is that the end goal, is sort of a curricular shift?
A curricular shift, but I'd say even beyond a curricular shift, in that, the question, I became obsessed. I think my students thought I was crazy, but the last couple of years I was teaching, I started to really obsess over the question of what is the point of education, which may sound really strange to teach for 7 years before really fixating on that question. But I became really kind of obsessed with it, and I started reading what kind of the greatest minds in history said about what the purpose was. And the purpose, seems to be continuity. And in fact, I would do this at the beginning of my class every day of a new semester with new students. I would say, what's the point of school? Why are we here? And they would in almost unison, they would say, to get a better job. And then I would go and I would write on the board, the purpose of education is to learn to love what is beautiful, Plato. And the students would be like, what does that even mean, right? But Plato wasn't a one-off. He ends up speaking in this long line, or the beginning of a long line of people all the way through Martin Luther King Jr., who said that the purpose of education is character. It's this shaping of affections. I think the best I can get at trying to synthesize what I think a lot of the greatest minds in history said about the goal of education, essentially it's kind of like something to become more human. And so it's interesting that, if you step back a bit and look at like the whole history of education, to get a better job is a really bizarre answer,
It just real quick, and I love that. Like, no one sees the video of this. I got a huge smile as you were saying that. I just mentored this past year a new teacher, first-year teacher who graduated from Wheaton College, which I think accepts the CLT now. I think. Yeah. A great guy, brilliant. I mean, he showed up first year. I was like, oh man, my job as mentor is easy. He's already better than half the teachers in the department. Like, he's going to make me look good too. But he designed this thing after talking with a professor, and he set this up. And this is actually, he did this on his board. And he said, "Why are you here?" He waited until all the kids were, bored and jaded. And why are you here? Oh, because I got to get whatever. Well, why are you doing this? To get good grades. Why do you need good grades? To get into college. Why do you need to go to a good college? To get a good job. Why do you need a good job? And he's saying this. I actually like peeked in, I'm watching, and kids are almost in unison, like, get a good job, to make more money. Why you want to make more money? And then it was a little bit of a split. Take care of family, to do this, to it. And some guy's like, so I can retire early. And everyone's like, yeah, retire early. And he goes, why you want to retire early? He goes, I don't know, so I can play a lot of golf and hang out. And he goes, so let me get this straight. You're sitting here in 10th grade, writing this essay, doing this work, so that you can retire a little bit earlier and play golf when you're 60, 70 years old. And the kids all like, they like, what? Oh, like they knew that this was a bad answer, right? And so he walked them backwards through it and then created a unit that was called What's Your Why? And he said, you need to have a good reason to be here, but I can't tell you what your reason is. And so I agree. This is something I talk with students a lot about, is that you need to be purposeful in what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. And so if the purpose of education is to become more human, or, a better human, I think about a lot about like development, then, we should be asking a lot of questions about the other things we're doing in school. I think most recently, obviously, we all know that especially in the earlier grades, school doubles as daycare. But man, as stuff's starting to go online, it has never been more clear than right now how important the daycare element is. If your goal, or one of your goals, is to help school to be more about that sort of personal development, that sort of elevating a human being, how do you do that? I mean, obviously the test is a start, but like, I'm going to sort of jump that one of the questions I normally ask people is like, what's your ideal school? And I think maybe we have arrived at that a little earlier than in most talks, but what do you think, if you could design your own school, not just homeschool, like I know you said you homeschool your kids, but if you had a budget and you could pick a building, a staff, anything you could have a forest school, you could have a regular school, you could what would you think would be good if you had 1,000 kids and you got to run them through your program? Like, what do you think would be best?
Yeah, Brian, that's a great question, and also just as a thank you for. I'm so encouraged that especially as a public school teacher, you're having conversations with students about higher things, and that there is this whole hook, line, and sinker buy-in to utilitarian views of education in the mainstream education arena. And ultimately, I really believe that leads to student depression, student boredom, student complacency. Like they're here for something bigger at the end of the day. They're alive for something bigger than just to get a job. And we've got to rescue this. So the question, and now I just lost it.
Well, like so if you were going to create your own school, and like for what you just said, I would say that the kid who just wants to get technical skills and get the job should have that opportunity. Not that the kid should never have to read a book, but I would be okay with a kid who wants to focus in an area and say someone else wants to. So for me, I wouldn't throw away the STEM focus. I just don't know that that's for everyone. Likewise, I don't know that the humanities approach is for everyone. And so but that's hard to do on an institutional level, or a statewide level. That would be, how do you implement that sort of thing? But what would your school be? What do you think is the ideal form of schooling and education?
Yeah, I think a really concrete answer would be the Veritas School in Richmond. So Keith Nix is the president of the board at CLT, and he started this school, and he started it with the conviction that architecture and beauty is fundamental and matters. And he sold parents on this vision to such a degree that he was able to raise money over the years, and they bought an old kind of dying seminary. I think it was called Union in Richmond. They took over this old campus. They revitalize it. They sold people on this beautiful vision. They didn't start off with money or resources. They started off with a beautiful vision for the way beauty matters. And, you look at the old centers of learning, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard even, they're beautiful physically. I think we're seeing something about the priorities, the mindset of the public education arena, government school arena, just by the buildings themselves. And so to me, that's the very first thing. Of a student should be blown away with the beauty of a place when they walk into the building. That's the very first thing. And then from that, I think that there's a continuity of coursework over the whole time that students, I think education, no matter where you go around the world for years, is the passing on really of wisdom and tradition and culture from one generation to the next. And to me, it's becoming increasingly vague what exactly we're passing on. I'm a big Chesterton enthusiast, and that's the way Chesterton described that education is the soul of a society as it passes on from one generation to the next. And so I think a school that draws students into the beauty of tradition, This is the most quoted quote around CLT. I know you can't see it if you're listening here, but this is Gustav Mahler. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. And it's a shocking quote because it's exactly the opposite way most people think about tradition. We think about tradition as boring. But students, I mean, think about the experience any student has when they visit, maybe if they get the opportunity to visit, old Rome, or they get to go visit Europe and they go to the old part of center city of the old city. You're captivated by the beauty, the romance of it. And that can happen in the classroom here as well, when we draw students into something that's older and bigger than themselves, And what's incredible about that is, I sometimes pitch this to people and they say, well, we've got to prepare students, for a 21st century global economy. How does it make sense to be focusing on this old classic stuff? The truth is that the only way you can have any perspective on the world as it is in the 21st century is to immerse yourself in another world, in an older world. It's the same thing that happened. My parents lived in France when I was in college. When I started going there for summers and winters, I suddenly had a whole new understanding of America. I never would have understood it that way if I hadn't spent time in France, but it allowed me to have some perspective. And it's the same thing. The students that are actually the most observant about our own cultural period are the ones that have had a chance to really immerse themselves in another.
And I like the beauty of the campus thing. I think that our prison style architecture is not ideal. I don't want to tell the same joke too many times on the podcast, but I think I just said it in the last episode. I think I'm well liked at my school, but I have probably the worst classroom, not just in the school, maybe in the entire county. I think long before they renovated the school, I think years and years ago, it was like a shop room. There are no windows. There's a server room in the back, so it's hot. Like, it's just cinder block walls. I have a lot of cool stuff up, so it doesn't look so bad, but if you walk into the bare room, it looks like a prison cell, and that is discouraging. You also run into obvious problems with, budgeting for, nice architecture if you're trying to create 15 schools in a county or something like that. It sounds like you're describing a school that is still very much a school, but that might look nicer, be more inviting, and that the curriculum would have more of a liberal arts and sort of classical focus. Would you change anything about the operation of a school? Some people object to the idea of bells, or personally, the longer I teach, the more I wish I could do a interdisciplinary class. Like, I would like to be teaching history in English or biology in English. I think that the line that we draw between them is very artificial, but I'm not, that's not your idea. I'm just saying, like, some people, when I've asked this question, have ideas about a big structural change in how the school day itself would go. You're envisioning sort of a different place. And by changing the place, you change the spirit. Would you change what people actually do? Like, would the daily functions be different, or would it be similar to what we do now?
I don't really know if I have an opinion, and I love to learn more about different ideas that are out there. I mean, CLT, we spend a ton of time in the homeschool world. About 40% of our students are homeschool. And this has been really interesting. Over the past 4.5 years, after every single test we administer, I try to always call the top 3 score recipients. And more often than not, the top 3 score recipients are this very unusual group of students. I don't do this as a parent, as a homeschool parent, but they're the homeschooling families who not only do they homeschool, but they don't use any umbrella organization at all. Now, I think there are great umbrella organizations. I love them all. We've got great relationships with groups like Classical Conversations and Mother Divine Grace and others. But what they do is, this is literally schooling that's entirely removed from grades, from a bell system. The students are kind of chasing their curiosity. When you look at, and it might sound totally insane to have that conversation, but when you look at people like Abigail Adams or Ben Franklin or even Malcolm X, all of them had hardly any formal schooling at all. And that's not to say we should just chuck formal schooling and just all go crazy and just see what happens. That is to say, there was something happening there that perhaps this very structured day is actually kind of cutting against, that it's very possible that maybe not just publics, but also a lot of privates actually stomp out a lot of curiosity. And so I think as we think about what could a school look like, those kind of questions ought to be, how do you cultivate wonder? How do you cultivate the imagination and curiosity rather than stamp it out? Because those are the things that are central to, I think, authentic learning.
So, yeah, I mean, that's an idea that has come up again and again on the podcast, unintentionally, but I think it's just because like I'm talking to some classroom teachers, I've talked to some students, former students, things like that. Like the idea is just that everybody has some skin in the game here. Like even if you don't attend school, you're paying taxes towards it. Like it's a thing that we should care about collectively, like education and taking care of young people and helping them. Like all these are important things. So I feel like everybody should have some opinions here, but in trying to get ideas that we don't hear about in your typical faculty meeting, the idea of unschooling has come up a few times. And it was, I think, 2 or 3 episodes before this. I talked to Katina Sweetie Franklin, who is one of the leaders at an unschooling, like a self-directed learning center in Loudoun County, Virginia. And she was great. It was an awesome conversation, but they essentially have a building and they have students, but then everything is sort of democratically run. Kids can search it. And it's very much this kind of free rangey kind of thing. But I think, and I don't think that that's for everyone, but I do think if you're a kid who has some curiosity or a strong independent streak, I think you can get a lot done there because when you're young, I think most people are naturally curious. And I think sometimes school beats that out of us. It's the same way, like, when I was young, I loved to read. And the older I got, the less I read, not because I don't like reading, but because now reading is work. And I have students who say, well, I read for school, And so when you say those top scoring students don't have that curriculum, is that, I mean, I don't know how long you talk to the kids, but is that sort of the unschooling where they just, hey, you're free to go do your thing? Or is this sort of a blend where the parents say, well, here's the stuff we're going to work on, but the kids just get a little more flexibility with it? Like how free are those students who do well on your test?
So I think the central concern, I say this a lot on Twitter and other places, and I say this partially, Ryan, as a Roman Catholic, and I think for people who aren't Catholic, one of the longest standing education traditions in the world is the Catholic education tradition. I mean, they literally kind of invented the university system in medieval Europe, with Oxford and Cambridge and these institutions that are still very much alive. But at the very forefront of the Catholic education idea is that parents are the first and primary educators of their own children. And so whether you do send your kids to a public school or private or homeschool or whatever, parents having central ownership, the people who know the kids the best. And I'm a dad of 5. I know y'all have 2. Kids are beautiful and amazing and great. And my kids are super different. I think a lot of, so we're making different educational choices based on different kids we have. Some of my kids would be a train wreck in a free range kind of school. Some of my kids would actually do great. My boy Wells, he's 9. He could wander around and pick up a book and read for 3 hours. And my daughter Grace will just be talking about the latest thing on Instagram with, the other kid. Like, she needs the structure, the discipline. He doesn't. He's going to chase down the right things kind of on his own. And so I think that's the first part of this conversation. And I was very sad to see some of the things come out at the beginning of COVID. One of the letters from a high school principal, they got a lot of play on Twitter, was the principal saying, don't attempt to educate your children at home. We're the experts. We're going to be up and running very soon with, new virtual, and this mindset where parents in some ways like surrender responsibility because a school system is there. I think that's been an absolute disaster for America as a whole. Wherever you send your kids to school, you're their parents, be their parent and take control. Like nobody's going to educate your kids or care about their education the way a parent can. So I think to me, given all the options, that's the one thing that's got to be unifying.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that I didn't see the letter you're talking about. And I think each community sort of responded differently. I know where I work and where I live, I mean, they're right next to each other. The counties are right next to each other. There was a lot of stress because parents were trying to do so much to help. And it was the combination of, depending on the grade level, like, I just don't know that. I don't remember this stuff. I don't know what to do with this. Or the difficulty trying to access the technology and, how do I log into this or that? And that's part of like an emergency response, right? Like if we're going to be online in the fall, we need to do a little more front loading of information and offer the parents a little better training and support and stuff. But in that situation where you say, they said, don't try to educate your kids, I think that that's pretty obviously the wrong message. And I don't know that many people would agree with that with him anyway, because it's like saying that you have no responsibility for your own health because you go to the doctor once in a while. Like the fact that I attend, go in for a checkup, the fact that the doctor exists doesn't mean that I don't have responsibility for my own well-being. And especially, and I say this to students all the time, I'm like, guys, like there's nothing I can do. When I stand up here and I tell you some stuff, I'm not teaching if you're not learning, and that means you have to be doing stuff. And so if I just say, hey, here's the stuff, you go figure it out, or if I stand up front and lecture you for a little bit, it's that in the end, you're still responsible for it. Like, I'm being paid to facilitate and provide this for you, but you have to have some ownership, because if you don't want to do it, like the doctor can tell me all the time that I should, eat fewer French fries and do more sit-ups, but it's up to me to make these decisions, Sometimes I agree and sometimes I don't. And so in terms of where that responsibility lies, I mean, it sounds like, you're leaning hard on home, and I think that's probably a good thing. I want to ask, because aside from the denotation, the technical meaning, there's a lot of connotation in a phrase that you've used a couple of times. And so when you say government school, in a literal sense, that just means a school funded by or run by the government. But that can also, depending on the conversation, be a loaded phrase that can have a lot of other meanings that carry with it. So when you refer to homeschool, private school, government school, what does government school mean to you?
Yeah, it means publicly funded, or a school that's immune from that is being protected from competition. And so a video that I posted the other day, I'm in the private education sphere, and the way that we compete against a bunch of other companies is we try to make a really beautiful, seamless user experience for students. I actually had my third grader still in public school just last year, and so we knew with him that we experienced firsthand what parents were going through with the beginning of COVID and the shutdown. But I was thinking about that as I'm trying to navigate this ridiculous, cumbersome website of like, this wasn't developed to maintain customers. This wasn't, you know what I mean? Like, this is something that's totally immune to having to do that. It's kind of the feeling at the DMV. Like, the DMV doesn't have to improve their user experience because you can't go anywhere else to get your license. And so they can just keep offering the same terrible user experience, and nobody can really do anything about it. Whereas if competition is introduced into the education kind of marketplace, and this was to me what I was shocked when I made the transition, Ryan, from 8 years of public school into the private school arena. Like, the administration, the faculty, everybody, so hospitable, here to serve and to serve well the students and the parents that are paying their money to send their kids here, because they can just as easily go somewhere else, And so it really does, like, it has a huge impact on the budget and waste and everything else. I think that those schools are run better. And often people say, well, private schools are run better because they have more money. No, private schools nationwide, the average cost of private school is actually less than the average per pupil spending, which is over $15,000 in America for public. The reason that they run better is because that they're having to compete. And that having to compete, just like any other company, when you got two ice cream shops in town, one shop's going to drop their prices and offer a little more ice cream, maybe some sprinkles or on top or whatever, in order to get your business, and the consumer wins. I think that's the same idea in education, and I think at the heart of why America is sort of in crisis, with I think education. This is one of the major solutions is school choice.
I get stuck on this one because there's parts of school choice that I like. Like, I agree that we should have some more competition. And I also think that by having some kind of choice program in place, it would allow for more innovation. That's one of the things that I think I've developed my thinking on most since starting the podcast. Like, doing this podcast was actually my students' idea. Like, we were talking a lot, and they're like, hey, we like hearing you talk. You should do this outside of school. And they said, eventually I was like, all right, so we took a shot at it, But one of the things that I've learned is that there's so many different ideas about things that we could do in school, but it's so hard to get so many of them done. And so in my mind, that's because there's so many layers of bureaucracy that dictate what should or shouldn't happen in the classroom. And so many of those things are defined by people who have very little classroom experience or none beyond when they were in school. And so, I like the idea of choice and competition because it means that some schools could, say, specialize in the humanities, or we could have that STEM magnet school. We can do and let kids figure it out, pick where they want to go, or have the parents do it. One of my concerns with it, though, is that I think in the end, there are very few school choice programs that I've read about, in states that have done this a little bit, or in localities that allow for vouchers between the schools, say within the county and things like that. There tends not to be as much support for poor students, or in some cases for students with disabilities, unless there's some sort of quota system put in place. Because if we turn, say, is it 15,000? I thought it was like 13,000, but whatever. However, let's say it's 15,000 a year per student. You got to remember that that's not what the average person's paying. And so, if we just let you keep your tax money and pick a school, the average or say, below average income family can't afford a lot of options. And so one of the things you end up seeing is sort of a brain drain where your wealthiest or most capable kids get scholarships. And then you're left with this public school sitting there that has only the poorest or neediest students who didn't get in elsewhere. And so when I see those things, I also have concerns about teacher like healthcare and benefits. And that's not trying to get rich. That's just like when you lay into that competition, that takes away some of the very few benefits that I think teachers probably already have. But I think you end up with this weird drain situation. And I haven't seen too many systems that correct for that. In a broad sense, I love the idea of school choice, and I think we could do a lot better. In practice, like have you seen places that do that well, where we don't end up with these random public schools that it's just like, well, that's all that's left, and so you have the poorest or least capable students, because that's a bad situation. Like, have you seen places that do it better?
Yeah, Ryan, my wife's going to be listening to my response to this question. So she's a graduate of the University of Virginia and went Teach for America out of college for 2 years in inner city New York. Really thoughtful about education. It's she shares with you this major concern about school choice. I think done well, it sort of has to be done whole hog and all at once. And so if you privatize this system and you say that schools now are going to be privately run and that parents, essentially, let's take a look at what we do with food stamps, for example, right? We don't fund grocery stores in America, right? Grocery stores have to compete.
With the farm bill, I mean, you're paying way less for your food than you should be, but that's a separate discussion.
Discussion. What we do is we fund families with food stamps. And the families then have the freedom to say, well, this grocery store is better for us. Maybe they want to buy whatever. Right? We leave that to the families. That's really good. And I think it would be a disaster with food stamps if we said, you can only go to this grocery store, right? That grocery store would then be de-incentivized to serve those families well because they have no other option. And I think that's at the heart of kind of the school choice idea.
But but as an analogy though, you got to be careful because a grocery store doesn't have a physical capacity in the same way. I mean, it does, but it doesn't have the same limitations that a school does. If a school is going to operate on a semi-traditional schedule from, 8 to 3 or 9 to 4, whatever your school day is, you can only put X number of kids in that building. You only have X amount of space. Whereas the grocery store is open for 18 hours a day. And if they sell more food, they just bring an extra truck in the back. Like they can replenish and prepare in ways. And so I understand the point you're making. Yeah. I'm just saying that as an analogy, I don't want to be mean about that. Like as a simple analogy, it works. But when you look at any of the details of it, the food stamp system wouldn't be the same because there's barring national disaster or something. There's always going to be more food, but there isn't always going to be another seat in the better school. And so that kid is still left hungry. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's not an easy way to transition, I think is part of what you're pointing out. And I would agree with you there that, if you were to have a privatized education system that gives parents the freedom to send their own children to the best school, how do you get there from where we're at right now? I don't know. And I don't know that there's an easy answer for how you make that transition. I do know that I'm meeting a lot of families. One of my friends, he's the superintendent in the Archdiocese in Ohio. And a fourth of their students are there on vouchers. And a lot of these students came from really bad inner city schools that are poorly run and that are violent and that don't offer kids a safe, great learning environment. Because of the voucher system in Ohio, those students they're getting a great education in a better learning environment, smaller class sizes. It's a win-win. But now because so many students have taken advantage of the program, the teachers union now has it front and center as one of their main issues, and they want to fight against the voucher program, and keep students from being able to have that option. And so the whole question of school choice has been, at this point, hyper-politicized, of course, with it going almost directly along party lines. I think Yang was one of the few guys, from what I hear on the Democratic side, who was a school choice supporter.
He was, I think Booker maybe. There was another one. There was I'm very interested in politics and find there are very few politicians I like. And of all of the people who ran or said they were going to run, Andrew Yang was the only person I actually felt good about. That's probably the only time I've said this on the podcast, but like there was just this really nice blend of like things that are good for business and things that are good for people. And he's a data-driven guy. So he's just like, if it works, we should do that. I didn't read enough about it, but he had an idea there, and to the opposite of that, Joe Biden at some point said, and I think he's walked it back, but I think a month or two ago, he said, if I'm elected president, there'll be all vouchers are done or something like that. He was just going to kill school choice essentially. And I thought, I don't know if that's good either. Like that's probably not productive. It's one of those issues where the devil's in the details, because like for me, I'm a competitive person and I'd like to believe I'm a good teacher. And so I always say, like, if you let kids pick their spots, like I have no doubt that I would be at capacity. Or if you did like a lottery system and then you auction off the last 5 seats in my class and give me half the proceeds, let the school keep the rest, we'll all get rich, because I teach some rich kids and I know there's 5 kids that would pay to be in the room. Like I don't worry that people wouldn't show up, but I know that a lot of teachers do, and that's one of the things we saw with going online is that the compulsory nature of education is tricky. Like when you're there by force, it makes it hard, If somebody tells you eat your vegetables, you're like, well, I wasn't sure I wanted to eat them anyway, but now no. If somebody tells you eat a bowl of ice cream, you're like, cool, unless they say it in a mean voice. And then even then you're like, maybe I don't want to, right? And that's what we do with school. We school should be an interesting and fun thing, or at least a productive thing, but we force it. And so by giving people choice, I think it would alleviate some of that like rebellion against school, because you have this sense, I've chosen this, I've done the thing that's best for me. I just really don't know how we do it, and that's why when you say school choice, like I, in the very broadest sense, say, yeah, I'm with you. And then every time somebody talks about how to do it, like I always feel like, we're going to alienate the people who need the most help. And that's the tricky thing that we've seen with that, and it works itself out better at the college level, maybe.
It is beautiful. And I think, again, having taught my first 3 years in inner city New York, I do care about the achievement gap. I do care about students that are underprivileged and their whole life is going to be impacted by it. The fact that there are really real ideas of saying, we can actually fund these families directly and let them go to a great private school or, whatever it may be. I think that's something that needs to trump like any kind of political loyalty or party loyalty. And hopefully that'll happen, I think, in the next few years. I think COVID is creating this massive disruption throughout the entire education sphere. And I think there are people across the aisle who are saying, wow, you know what? School choice at the end of the day, it's going to be messy to get there, but it's good for students. It's good for parents. It's good for underprivileged students to be able to have the same opportunity. And Corey DeAngelis is somebody who I'd really recommend you having on your podcast. He is the leader of, I would say, the school choice movement. He's got about 30,000 followers on Twitter right now. He's a great guy, and he deeply cares about underprivileged students. And what he does is he spends a lot of time calling out politicians who they fight against school choice, but always send their own kids to a private school. He's saying, why don't we give everybody that opportunity by just taking the money we're already spending and giving them the freedom to pick from some different options.
And full disclosure, I said my uncle went to seminary when he was 15. My mom's one of 5, and I think her youngest brother ended up going to public school, but all the other 4 went to private Catholic school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at a time when there was still a public voucher system. So if my grandparents had to pay out of pocket for 4 kids to go to the private school, they couldn't have done it. But with, there was still some sort of, I don't know the details of it. My mom said, she's like, we went, but it's because part of it was paid by the city because we weren't taking up a desk in one of the public schools. And so that's not even necessarily a new idea. Like I think there's a lot of tricks in how you figure it out. My other concern, and this one is very selfish, but a lot of charter and private schools, not all, but a lot of them have either limited pay or limited benefits for the teachers. And that's where I always say, like, it depends on where you teach. When you say, should teachers be paid more? Like, depends on where we're talking about. Like where I work, no, I'm paid perfectly fine for my work. I'm not paid for the work I do at night. Like I emailed you last night at like 1 a.m. because I was actually doing schoolwork to get ready for the fall. They don't pay me enough for what I do at home, but I am paid perfectly fine for where I'm at. When you look at some of the private schools, say around this area, my options would be either to take a very noticeable pay cut or to keep my pay, maybe make a little more, but I'd be giving up pension and healthcare and things like that. And so, the things that make the teaching job attractive are some stability, like long-term stability, and it's good for raising a family. Sometimes you lose that. And so, that's my selfish concern. The school, it doesn't exist for the teachers, it exists for the students. But then once you have that structure in place, you're going to have a few million people scrambling to find new jobs, and that's going to be another disruption. And so that's like one of those ripple effects that we would have to be careful about if we were to go the route, like you said, of an all at once cold turkey go to school choice. That would be a huge shift in the employment sector as well. And that's why that's so complicated.
And I hear what you're saying with teacher pay. My last 2 years in teaching in a public school, I would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I would put my lawnmower into the back of my car, our old SUV. I had 4 kids. I would go and I would teach. I would immediately go from teaching to mowing lawns. By 5 o'clock, I had to be at the evening high school to teach kids who had failed out of their day school class. And I would teach until 9. And I would get home at about 9:30 or 9:45. It was insane looking back at doing these 15-hour days. And then at 9:45, after my kids are asleep and I haven't seen them the entire day, still have to lesson plan and get ready for the next day tomorrow. It's truly insane. And part of the problem though, Ryan, it's not lack of funding, it's massive growth of bureaucracy around education. And so you look at the percentage of funds that are going to administration and to the Board of Education versus to teachers. Teachers should make 90% at least of all the funds that are paid in any given county or state. Some states it's as low as 40%. And so it's just, you have massive bureaucracy that sucks up the pay that should be going to hardworking teachers.
Yeah, and I have a friend of mine, is John Cassica. He's a sales executive for Canvas, learning management system. And I forget what episode it was in the podcast, but it was like the day after schools closed for us. I was like, oh man, everybody's going to go online. Wait, I know a guy who's about to make a whole lot of money as everybody goes online. And one of his big complaints is, especially as you move into the northeastern part of the country, how you don't even do by county. It's school districts, and every district has a superintendent. And so when I tease him, I'm like, you're making all this money selling software. That should be going to the teachers. And his response is always, look at what those superintendents get paid. That should be going to the teacher. And I'm like, buddy, these are not mutually exclusive. We could do both. So as we're thinking about school choice, what do you think about schools going test optional? You sound like a guy who likes choice, which would mean that as more colleges, and not just in the short term, I mean, next year, most colleges are going to be test optional because so few people have access. I mean, you guys test online, right? So it wouldn't be for lack of access, but there's been a trend over the last 2, maybe 3, 4 years that more and more universities are considering making SAT, ACT, CLT optional. Yeah. What's your view on that? Because I mean, that's going to hurt it's going to hurt the piggy bank, but it might fall in line nicely with some of the choice stuff you're talking about.
Yeah, test optional, I would say, is really kind of a myth. And so I think a lot of people think test optional, okay, SAT and ACT, I've heard so many people tell me this, they're kind of fading. Their power and influence is diminishing. The exact opposite is happening. I really hope people hear this. SAT and ACT primarily do business by working with lobbyists in 30 plus states now to push through legislation that forces a lot of public school students to take the PSAT or SAT or ACT as a graduation requirement. So for SAT and ACT, increasingly, they don't care what the colleges do. The colleges can all go test optional, but because College Board is still contracting with Illinois for a $60 million contract, test optional doesn't really make a difference to them. So that's part of it, is that test optional is not in any way diminishing the influence of College Board or the ACT. The other part is that there's an inherent tension with the growing homeschool movement. As a homeschool dad, I'm guilty of this. I give my kids A's. I love them. As we talked earlier, test grade inflation and a need for some kind of an objective external metric. And so CLT, when we look at our data, a lot of the homeschool families, actually students, they cluster around the very top and also around the bottom. And so some homeschool families, they think they're doing a great job, and then they take a test like the CLT, and it's like, no, it's not going well. Whatever you're thinking is happening at home, it's not happening, right? But others, they just absolutely crush it. They're at the very, very highest of the high. And so there's an inherent tension, I think, between the growing homeschool movement and the test optional movement. And so, in fact, a lot of schools have even gone test optional, but not for homeschool students. And so I think right now a lot of colleges have kind of when you go test optional, but 75% of colleges haven't, you're not really impacted because most kids have a test score anyway. We're getting into kind of uncharted waters now where the majority of colleges are going to be test optional, and we're going to have more students than ever that don't really have a GPA. I can't tell you the number of homeschool families I know who make a total joke of the GPA. They believe that grades are a product of industrial revolution, factory model education, and they hate grades. They give their kids a 4.0 to check off a box, but they don't take grades seriously. They see them as a distraction to authentic learning, not anything that's going to facilitate learning. And so, yeah, you're going to get a transcript from the homeschool kid that's got a 4.0. You need something else besides that. And I think that's probably where we agree that a standardized test score can help.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting you say that. Like, I'm big on pass-fail grades, and if I was given a little more control in my classroom, and my school administration is great. Like, I take on a very long drive to work just because I like where I work, and they let me do what I want to do for the most part, but I don't get to change the grading scale. And I would love if I could do pass, fail, and advanced. Like, the top 3 kids in the room get advanced. Everybody else, get yourself 70% or whatever. You passed it, because that way I don't have to waste my time on arguing the difference between an 88 and a 90, because in an English class, there is basically no difference between an 88 and a 90. But then I also have to tell the kid, I'm sorry, you have the 88 and I can't give you the 90, because while this already doesn't mean a lot, it means even less if I just start making up the numbers. Like, we've got to use what we got. We can all agree that it's flawed, but I can't make it worse by faking it for you. Like, you got to take what you get. Yeah. And I agree. I think it's a distraction. I also think that I see a lot of parents online talking about, well, if it's pass fail, or if the grades don't count, my kid won't do it. And I'm like, well, that's an issue that you need to address at home, because that means your kid doesn't care about learning. And I mean, don't get me wrong, like, you might have a class that you just don't care about. That's fine. But if you just say, I don't care about any of them, I don't want to learn any of this stuff unless there's a grade attached, that's a bigger problem. That's an intrinsic lack of intrinsic motivation. And that's probably something parents need to address, because I don't know that any one school teacher is going to fix it for you. And so in terms of, say, disregarding the grades, I'm fine with it. But yeah, that you're right. It probably makes the test, as we said before, more necessary. For your test, like, how ambitious are you?
Oh, we're crazy.
Well, let me clarify what I mean, because I like you said, and I wrote it down somewhere. Like, it's something like almost all of your testers are homeschool or private school, right? It's like 95% or something.
Yeah, historically 98% charter school, private school, homeschool. But with COVID, we jumped all the way up to about 20% public.
Okay,
we hope to keep pushing it on that direction.
If you had your way with all of this, would you end up like with an even market share with SAT, ACT? Would it be like a third, or like, we
want to be number one. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like, I think they each do somewhere, I don't know what the numbers were last year, but somewhere around 2 million tests, a little more, a little less each year. Like, how many tests did you guys do last year?
Yeah. Oh, 2019, the last year that I saw was last academic year. I think this year will be around 35,000. The previous year we were around 20,000.
Okay. So 20,000, and they're, say, around 2 million, but you're only a few years old. The SAT's been around for almost 100 years. Is the goal to get to that point? Yeah.
So CLT, we genuinely love the free market, and which sounds crazy, because I think, especially in the public school arena, people are like, ooh, capitalism is just a bad thing. No, capitalism, it is an economic system that rewards people for serving other people well, for solving other people's problems. And so we say every day we want to be, whatever you want to call it, the Southwest Airlines or the Chick-fil-A of standardized testing. Like, we want to win on serving students better than College Board. And I can't tell you the number of times I called College Board as a college counselor when I was at Mountain Sales Academy. You're on hold for 45 minutes. You finally get somebody, they're annoyed with you for calling, they transfer, they have a bad attitude. It was wild. Like, no, you're a company, you're here to serve people. And that's why we love the free market. And so we say, look, we're gonna beat College Board and ACT. We're gonna do it with a better vision for education, but we're really gonna do it with better customer service as well. And that's what our students are saying. We're getting well over 85% of our students on every test say this was a better experience for me than the SAT or ACT. They're taking it from the comfort of home through online remote proctoring. They're taking a shorter test. I mean, think about this for a second. SAT is a 4-hour test, but if you have accommodations and you get double time, it's an 8-hour test.
Yeah, a lot of times they split it out. Now it's a 2-day deal. Your whole weekend's gone.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
That should be criminal to make a kid test for 8 hours. That's horrible. So CLT, we cut the length of the test in half. It's a 2-hour test. You get your results within a week. It's online, remotely proctored from your house. So we work really hard, obsessively hard, to beat them on the customer service front. And they've honestly set the bar really, really low. I mean, these companies are companies that kind of look and smell like the DMV. They're not focused on customers. They're focused on lobbyists and winning big state contracts. And I think the marketplace is already really, really rewarding CLT for what we're doing.
So, I mean, with that, you mentioned accommodations. If you've got a kid, who's taking a 3-4 hour standardized test, but they get double time, and say the College Board acknowledges it, and they're pretty picky. They're a little tighter about giving testing accommodations than, say, the average public school is. There are plenty of kids who have accommodations in school that don't always get them on the test. Since you're dealing with a lot of students in private school, charter school, homeschool, where they may or may not have that paperwork, it's not the main reason, but it is a common reason that people turn to homeschooling, is because they have a child with learning disability. They don't feel like they're getting services at school. So if that student goes through homeschool and chooses to take the CLT, do you guys allow for extra time or other testing accommodations? And how do you vet that if you have students who maybe don't have the traditional paperwork or identifications?
Yeah, we never allow for accommodations without the proper paperwork. And so students have to submit 6 weeks in advance actually to get CLT accommodations. And so we meet almost every accommodation. Sometimes when a student needs a translator, we haven't been able to provide one in time given the location. That's pretty tricky sometimes for a student that's hearing impaired. But yeah, we're about, I think 7-8% given different tests, students have accommodations. And so we absolutely want to meet that demand as well. And really, again, serve those students better than they're being served with College Board.
Okay. I want to ask you an honest question. I don't mean this as like a hardball question, but my question about sort of the scope or your vision for growth factors into this. And so if, you said last year you were up to 20% was public school, but traditionally before that you were 98% was homeschool private school. So I read somewhere, and I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was like 80 or 85% of the test takers are white students. And you're pulling from a classic sort of Western tradition, et cetera. One of the things that the SAT has done, in addition to maybe trying to avoid offending anyone, is they've tried to avoid texts that include like certain levels of cultural bias where it requires that you're going to have this sort of background knowledge. Like any person should be able to read the passage. And if you have the requisite reading and thinking skills, you can do this. If your goal is to become a large scale test like that, are you concerned about the bias included in the test? Because as you pointed out, you're intentionally going to this Western classical tradition. You are intentionally pulling from, you have some Catholic and Christian thinkers and the rest. That doesn't mean that anyone should be able to read it and take the test, but do you have concerns about what that bias looks like as you broaden your test base or your student base? Like, is that when you're only dealing with private and homeschool, it doesn't matter because they chose the test, they chose the situation. This test is in a way almost for them. But if you're going to test 2 million kids, rich, poor, black, white, various religions and everything else, are you concerned about what that bias would look like if you reach that scale?
Yeah, I am not, and I'm not because, the reason the classical tradition, I would argue, should take precedence is because it really was a tradition that gave birth to America in the first place. And some of the most passionate defenders you see of this tradition are leaders in the Black intellectual tradition in America. So CLT, we spend every quarter as a company. We're kind of weird. We literally read out loud together every morning for the first 15 minutes of the day. We're currently doing W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois is emphatic that no, he argued against Booker T. Washington. No, blacks should not have vocational training. We want the real deal. We want a real liberal arts education just like the rich white kids get. He was emphatic. Du Bois says, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Frederick Douglass is just as emphatic as Du Bois. MLK, the same way. He was immersed into this same tradition. And so it's interesting to me that the people who usually tell CLT we're pushing the ideas of dead white men is almost always white people. We've got on our board Dr. Anika Prather. She has her PhD on Du Bois from the University of Maryland College Park she focused on the classical tradition within the Black intellectual tradition. Joyce Burgess, she's the founders of the National Black Home Educators. She's one of the most diehard defenders CLT has. And she says, no, absolutely. This is the tradition of Blacks. This is the tradition that we were freed to receive a liberal arts education, which literally means the education for free people, which is this classical tradition. They ought to be reading Aristotle. They ought to be reading these same great ideas as well. I haven't seen a really clear third option between classical and kind of progressive secular education, which really they say they want to champion, multiculturalism and diversity and stuff, but it ends up being a lack of any tradition or a lack of any kind of cultural transmission. I think is what ends up being kind of a cultural void, is I think the experience for a lot of students. And so we feel like we're standing with Douglass and Du Bois and MLK to say, no, this is a tradition that great Black intellectuals have claimed as their own.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that it's intentional or that we're just casting people off. One of the reasons that the SAT went through large changes in the 1990s and then again to 2010, 2012, and those changes weren't actually great. That's what they changed. They basically changed back a little bit in the grading scale and everything else. But one of the things that they were working to do was to remove some of the testing bias, because there's a lot, all this data that's essentially East Asian, some South Asian kids, white kids, especially wealthier kids, are doing well. And then there's this huge sort of gap between in their test data with how Black and Hispanic students were doing. And so a lot of the changes in the test were meant to try to correct for that, not to make someone score better or worse, but just to make sure that the test itself wasn't the thing causing the difference. Yeah. And what's interesting is, like, I looked, and I didn't look at the whole thing. So this is a very, but I pulled up, you have a sample test on your website. And so I just sort of skimmed through the reading section, and it looks, at least visually, it looks very similar to the SAT that I took, in the late 1999, 2000, something like that. It looks like the older form of the SAT. And in talking about the texts and the ideas that you value, and I value too, to be fair, but it sounds like you're almost recreating the SAT before the SAT tried to remove that bias. And that's why I asked the question, like, what does that look like if you go large scale? Because as their tests got bigger and bigger and bigger, they were like, uh-oh, what are we doing? And you're sort of going the opposite direction on that. And so I'm wondering, if you move more into public schools, is that an equity issue, or is that something that would work itself out?
Yeah, so I think the SAT at its worst, you can find old passages where there's a reference, there's maybe an analogy, there's a reference to a hedge fund or a mutual fund or yachting, things that, your rich New England private school kid is going to totally get, and your inner city, minority student probably won't. That's not fair. CLT is doing something very different of saying, when we put students in front of Aristotle, it's equally removed from the lived experience of the rich New England private school student and, the rural student in the deep South, or the minority student who's in an inner city situation. So I think, we've definitely talked about that. We've accounted for that a lot. Part of the racial discrepancies with test scores, though, is also, I think, a bit of a myth. And so if you take, just in terms of looking at the data, you take, let's say, students, and this is where, in some ways, a standardized test is like the least PC thing imaginable, because it says things that people don't want to talk about. Students that have married parents, that have college degrees, have books in their house, have a decent income. When you zero in on that, the discrepancies based on race almost disappear entirely, regardless of the race. And so essentially SAT reflects existing socioeconomic differences between different groups. But I don't see a valid case that, it's necessarily, contributed to that.
And there's a lot of truth to what you just said. I tell kids early in the year, like usually second or third day of class, I have them fill out like a little info sheet about you, basic stuff, and then what are you into, what do you like? And it's a cheat sheet for me. I just read it, and that way I know a little bit about each kid, so we can get things going a little faster at the beginning of the year. But a couple of the questions I asked them is, what is the highest level of school your parents got through, and what do your parents do for a living? And I explain it before they fill it out. I say, you can leave it blank. I'm being nosy. And the reason I'm asking you is because if I asked you what I actually wanted, it would seem even more weird. But I said, you could take any group of kids in kindergarten, and if you tell me how far your parents got in school, how much money they make, and how many books are in your house, I could tell you in kindergarten with pretty decent accuracy the likelihood that you'll graduate from high school and the likelihood that you'll attend college. And so those things aren't untrue. we're in the middle, like in Loudoun County, we've gotten a big distraction with the COVID and all that, but they adopted new classroom libraries. Like every classroom got 250 books. It's a little bit everything. It's a lot of diverse authors and stuff because they went through the school libraries and they're like, we're real heavy on the dead white guy canon kind of thing. And so they didn't say to get rid of any of that. They're just like, hey, they got some grant funds and everybody got 250 extra books in the English classes and the elementary school classrooms. And then there was this whole fallout. It was really weird. Like people were looking for every reason to object to the books in the room. And I said, my thing was, if they told you had to get rid of the other books, that's a reason to object. But it should never be a problem to have more books around. And if you have more books by minority authors or immigrants or women or, LGBTQ, whatever, like it's not a bad thing to have the book and have the access. But there was a lot of pushback. And so I think sometimes when we get in these discussions in school, whether it's with testing or just the reading lists, I think a lot of other feelings and a lot of other concerns factor in. I think all of no offense. I mean, I know very little about the CLT compared to what I know about the SAT. I'm just going to say I think that almost all standardized tests are flawed in a lot of ways. Like it's not, like I said earlier, I don't think it's the ideal metric for a student. I just wonder about targeting a particular cultural piece if the goal is to test 2 million kids. You know what I mean? Yeah. And that's not saying that it's not a good test or it's not fair. My concern, like if I was advising my own students, I say, if this is the test you have to take to get into school, if I'm talking to I have a lot of Muslim students, I'd be we need to prep a different way. We need to do this a little bit differently.
Yeah. I read one article from a teacher who's talking about how, her students can't relate to Shakespeare, this dead white guy, because she teaches 100% minorities. And I taught 100% minorities for 3 years. When you unpacked what she was saying, it was completely devoid of substance. Okay, because her students are minorities, can they therefore not relate to loving somebody your family doesn't approve of? Can they not relate to heartache? Can they not relate to, these are universal human ideas. And Shakespeare was probably a white dude, right? But at this point, I think just because of that, he's being disqualified from having a platform to speak into universal human experience, where we
and if her students can't connect, that's probably more her fault in her presentation of it than Shakespeare's fault in being whoever he was. You know what I mean? That's your job to sell it to them and to help them connect to it. But yeah, I don't know. Some of the authors you mentioned, I'm like, this is all great stuff. And in my AP classes, most of our reading is older, because the parts of the AP exam that students traditionally struggle the most on are the older texts. So we read modern stuff, but I always tie it to something from the 17 or 1800s, just because I know that that's the hard stuff. And once we get halfway through the year, they get comfortable, they're good, the ideas work. So I don't think that any of this can't be done. I always just think about if testing is one of the things that creates hurdles for students to access higher education, how do we make testing better? I agree with a lot of what you're saying on the curriculum piece. I wouldn't necessarily throw away the STEM stuff, but I do think that it's good to have those connections to some classic texts and certainly to the philosophy pieces. It's just, how do we make sure that kids are demonstrating their abilities and knowledge to get into college? With that, do you think that too many kids or too few kids go to college? I don't know. We for decades, we've been pushing college. And we're starting to hear people talk more about trade schools and things like that. And again, thinking about some of the choice that you've brought in, the ideas of preparing students to be people, should more kids go to college?
Yeah, I do know. I think 20 to 30% probably of especially four-year liberal arts colleges are going to close in the next 3 to 5 years. COVID's probably just speeding that up. A lot of these colleges, they've had massive mission drift. It's not really clear, I think, even to them why they exist or what they're doing. And so there's going to be a real downturn. And I had a happy hour with some friends of mine a couple of years ago, and 5 of the 6 of us had gone to college. One went the firefighter route, and he does home inspections. He's making twice as much money as everybody else, and he was just roasting us for having spent 4 years in a college. So I think the onus is kind of on the colleges, for a lot of colleges, to kind of, in the digital age, colleges used to own access to knowledge. That's no longer the case. And so in the digital age where you've got in your phone more information than the Harvard Library, what is the value prop, of a 4-year college degree? That's not entirely known. I think a lot of actually the faith-based colleges that are about the formation and the development of the whole person, I think their value prop is a little stronger than some of the others that only have a vision of education that's kind of about learning things.
Yeah, and I mean, there's probably big changes coming. I did a podcast with, what was her name? Sarah O'Connor, who's the entrepreneur in residence at Kaplan, and she's working on their new boost year sort of gap year program and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But she said that her vision, she thinks that in the next decade, a lot of kids will essentially be bouncing between schools. They'll do, a few classes here, a few classes there, that it'll be like a buffet line where they're not going to be tied to a university. And I was like, the way she described it was like, that sounds great, but you're going to have to convince a whole lot of people who have a whole lot of money to change the way they're doing things to get there. But hey, who knows? All right. So, hey, I know we've been at this for a while. We need to wrap up soon. Is there anything else aside from the recommendations and, quick clarification that you want to address before we wrap up?
No, I think just for listeners, first of all, Ryan, very grateful. CLT typically doesn't get, because we often hit pretty hard against kind of mainstream education. We don't typically get a lot of love and welcome from, people in that arena. So huge thanks to you for giving me an opportunity to come onto the podcast, and grateful to people who have been dialed in for the whole time. Top book recommendation, we're reading out loud together as a family. We try to every night. We're reading To Kill a Mockingbird, which has been really cool, and I think really timely also, just given where we're at as a nation. Top movie, my wife and I just watched Just Mercy, which is super powerful. I don't know if you've seen that already.
It was great. Have you read the book? I
have not read the book.
I had a student recommend this because I do a unit in my classes on like mass incarceration, and just because there's a million things you can do with it, and you can talk about healthcare and education. You do whatever the kids run with the project. But a student a few years ago was like, you could use this book, Just Mercy, and so I bought a copy. And I was like, oh, whatever, I'll get around to it. I read it this spring, and then the movie had just come out. It's fantastic, and if you like the movie, it is absolutely worth the time to read the book, because there's like 3 more plot lines they don't use in the movie. There's some really powerful scenes that the movie like alludes to but doesn't include, and it's one where like my wife, I was like, let's watch it, and we got 10 minutes in, and she goes, what are we watching? I don't want to deal with this. And by the time it was over, she cried for like the last 40 minutes of the movie straight, and like immediately texted all her friends and said, you got to watch it. So yeah, that's a great one, and it's a great movie. The book might be 10 times better. So highly recommend that. So To Kill a Mockingbird, you're reading that with your family?
Yeah, we did The Princess Bride before that. And so something we've kind of talked about doing for a while. I've always done it with my boys and my girls before they were older. So ours are 14, 12, 9, 7. We have a 5-month-old as well. So we did the Lord of the Rings out loud and the Chronicles of Narnia out loud just with my boys. We were having so much fun. We thought, why don't we just do this the whole family? And COVID kind of allowed for that. So we did The Princess Bride first, which is really, really funny. I thought it was, and my boys thought it was. And then we did about halfway done To Kill a Mockingbird.
That's awesome. And wow. And congrats. I didn't know you had a new baby. So congratulations on it too. Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah. It's been, in some ways, there's a hard discipline to cultivate of like, okay, we're all going to drop everything we're doing and we're going to have this reading time. And it was kind of weird, especially for the older kids at first, but now they all genuinely love it. And it's been a really, really sweet kind of family time.
That's actually something right. When school shut down, I talked to an old friend she was an elementary school teacher, and then she became an elementary school assistant principal, and then like immediately was pregnant and had to go on like maternity leave. And then she was coming back and then got pregnant again. So she's like, now I'm just staying home with my kids. But she now works, and she advises student teachers. And so she's still in education, but I did a podcast with her, and she gave all kinds of advice for what parents can do with their kids at home when they're freaking out and they can't figure out how to access the website and do all that stuff. And one of the things that she talked most excitedly about was having like a family reading time where everybody just sits and reads together. And she's like, it's hard to get the habit, but it's so great. She's like, we're working through, I forget, I don't know, Harry Potter's. I have no idea what they were reading, but she's like, it's a really good time, and kids of different ages, as the older kids can start to read, they can take over the reading. The little kids are following along. Like, I was like, that sounds awesome. So that's something we're trying to do. All right. So we got you previously did Lord of the Rings, Narnia, but then Princess Bride, To Kill a Mockingbird, and Just Mercy. That's good. Anything, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have anything that you would recommend that just about education, like your views on homeschooling or on the testing? I know a lot of that stuff's very dry reading, but I've found some good educational stuff lately. Is there anything that you'd recommend to people there to help them understand some of these choices or the ways you're seeing education?
Yeah, I not in terms of reading. What I would recommend over that actually is sitting down with different people and touring different school options. And so you may have totally ruled out, like, I'm never even going to look at a private school, or we can't afford that, or I'm not going to even look at home schools. And so I think to look at and to explore the different options that are out there, it's cool to see what different people in different areas are doing.
Yeah, awesome. So we've got some great recommendations. We've covered a lot of ground talking about the CLT, talking about testing in general, and talking about the direction that schools are going with their curriculum and ways we might change, or in a very odd kind of way, talking about updating schools with some very old ideas, right? Trying to do a new thing that's actually a very old thing. Is there anything else that you would like to clarify, comment on, or sort of promote quickly before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, this has been great. Please do visit us. Our website, cltexam.com. Next test is August 22nd. And so we would love to keep growing on the public school arena on that date. So please do join us.
All right. Well, this has been Jeremy Wayne Tate talking about the CLT exam, and we thank you very much for listening.
Ryan, thanks so much for having me.